people are just really experiencing hardship out here right now. This is where the city is. Homeless folks have been left behind, neglected, to just die out.
Since the virus started, the number of people has increased.
Look at it. What the gentrification they're doing. Luxury apartments and then the rents go sky high. The population is growing. It grows. After this COVID-19, I won't be surprised that it grows even more.
CHIP started in 1972, and it was just a group of people that lived in the neighborhood that wanted to advocate for the less fortunate. It was created when this neighborhood really needed these kind of services, and now it's supported because it's a very wealthy neighborhood. Nobody is calling to complain about the homeless people that we're feeding. Alan used to come. Every day I would find him here in the morning, always in a good mood and always willing to help with anything at all. As the time was getting colder, I said, what do you think? Maybe we can ask Alan to come inside. We can get a cot. We fix up as much as we could. And every night he takes care of himself. And in the meantime, he's tremendous help to us.
I used to work at the post office. Did that for 10 years. Then I started doing things I wasn't supposed to do, like cocaine and drinking and carrying on. She left, took the kids. I got depressed, went out on the street, and that's where I was. At a blink of an eye. Living in the street ain't easy. When I first started living, I didn't know what the hell I was gonna do. The first night I stepped in the street was on the steps of a church. I didn't live anywhere until I got to the shelter.
The reason thoroughness is important is because every single link in the prosecutorial chain must be strong. It needs to be strong because trying this case will not be an easy thing. Winning a conviction will be hard. In fact, County Attorney Freeman is the only prosecutor in the state of Minnesota who has successfully convicted a police officer for murder.
I think I'm going to take a break from the rain. The rain's starting to pick up again, so I'm going to get underneath the canopy. pretty bad. This is about, I think this is the third wave of pretty intense rain that's come through here. Forecast calls for rain pretty much all evening.
I watched the video that a girlfriend sent to me saying, "Hey, this is your cop. This is Shaman." And at first I didn't recognize him, and then I saw a clearer angle, a close up, and I realized, oh my God, that's Shaman. And I just started kind of yelling at him to my phone, saying, "Stop! Get off of him! What are you doing, Shaman? Get up! What is wrong with you?" You know, I couldn't fathom what I was seeing. I knew that he kind of got into that zone sometimes, that mean cop zone, or whatever you want to call it. Like they lose a little bit of the humanity, they go into this power trip, and they almost kind of get glossy-eyed. And I've seen that before. You know, a lot of people, I think a lot of us have, that's why we're protesting. But it was really hard to see. It was really difficult, and it's something I don't think I'll ever understand. Then I found out it was George. I knew Shaman. I considered him a friend. We would sit and I would invite him for tacos at the end of the night. We'd talk about the events of the night and sometimes talk about how we were. And he didn't open up about his personal life to me or anything like that. Shaman was my off-duty police organizer. So in other words, he was kind of the manager that would hire all of the other off-duty officers and, you know, make sure that they were there on the days I needed, at the times I needed, and in the amounts of staff I needed. So we worked very closely for many.
Today, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, a Democrat, is expected to announce plans to remove one of the country's most iconic monuments to the Confederacy, a huge statue of General Robert E. Lee, which has been sitting for decades along Richmond's famed Monument Avenue. Now, this on the heels of the death of George Floyd, which has reignited racial tensions across the country. Civil rights activists believe this removal is a huge win for their cause and are now pushing for all other monuments of the Confederacy be removed across the country. Now, critics of this move say this is a push to remove history altogether. For more on this, let's bring in conservative radio talker Steve Gruber. All right, Steve, on one hand, folks are saying the time has come to remove all monuments that spark pain for the Black community. On the other hand, some argue that these monuments are not about racism, that they represent America's history, good, bad, ugly, that the Civil War actually killed lots of white Americans. How do you read this move? Governor Northam?
Well, I think there's some truth in everything you just said there, Janet, and Manila, and setting this up. And what I mean by that is these monuments do honor people that took up arms against the United States. And so I've never had an issue, honestly, with removing some of these Confederate statues. This one of Robert E. Lee has been there since 1890 in Richmond. And Richmond, of course, being the former capital of the Confederacy, where Jefferson Davis and his war council took up arms and fought the United States of America for 4 years. So the removal of Confederate statues, I understand that, honestly. I'm not sure that Ralph Northam is the right guy to be doing it based on his checkered past
Yes.
with the blackface and the Ku Klux Klan outfit and everything that he's been involved with. I think that's pretty questionable to have this guy. The irony is not lost on me.
Yes.
But in all honesty, I don't think we celebrate those that take up arms against the United States. And so I don't have an issue taking it down. But on the same token, as you mentioned, it is erasing history. It's a page from George Orwell. It's newspeak. It's let's erase the past and then it doesn't exist. It's important for people to understand the past so that we can learn from it. I think it's extremely critical. Now, the interesting thing about this 14...
Thursday marked the first of many memorials for George Floyd. In Minneapolis, members of his family, loved ones, and supporters gathered for a tribute. Floyd's golden casket was covered in red roses. A picture projected on the wall above it showed the mural of Floyd that's been painted at the street corner where he died. The mural reads, "I can breathe now." During the tribute, people stood in silence for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The amount of time police officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on Floyd's neck as he pleaded for his life. Almost 3 of those minutes, Floyd was unresponsive. This is one of George Floyd's younger brothers, Polonius Floyd.
It was just amazing. Everywhere you go and see people, how they cling to him. They wanted to be around him. You know, George, he was like a general. Every day he walks outside, it'd be a line of people, like just like when we came in, wanted to greet him and wanted to have fun with him. Guys that was doing drugs, like smokers and homeless people, you couldn't tell, because when you spoke to George, they felt like they was the president, because that's how he made you feel. He was powerful, man. He had a way with words. He could always make you ready to jump and go all the time. Everybody loved George. We didn't call him George. We called him Perry. If you called him Perry, you knew him direct, you know what I mean? Because George was the name, everybody called him Big George, Big Floyd, you know, Georgie Porgy. He had so many different names. But I'm going to go ahead and man, it's crazy, man. All these people came to see my brother, and that's amazing to me that he touched so many people's hearts, you know, because he been touching our hearts, you know. You come to 3rd Ward, where we're from, people are crying right now. That's how much they love them. You know, I'm just staying strong as I can, because I need to get it out.
This is Democracy Now!, Democracy Now!
Everybody wants justice. We want justice for George. He's going to get it. He's going to get it.
That's George Floyd's younger brother, Polonius Floyd, speaking during the tribute Thursday in Minneapolis, where Reverend Al Sharpton announced he's joining with the families of people killed by police to organize a march on Washington on August 28th, the 57th anniversary of the historic demonstration for civil rights led by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. It's also the day in 1955 Emmett Till was lynched. Reverend Sharpton urged those gathered Thursday to stand up in George's name and say, "Get your knee off our necks."
George Floyd's story has been the story of black folks, because ever since 401 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed to be in is you kept your knee on our neck. We were smarter than the underfunded schools you put us in, but you had your knee on our neck. we could run corporations and not hustle in the street, but you had your knee on our neck. We had creative skills. We could do whatever anybody else could do, but we couldn't get your knee off our neck. What happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks.
That's the Reverend Al Sharpton speaking at the tribute to George Floyd
Good,
Thursday
excellent, man.
in Minneapolis,
I'm
attended by
YouTube
thousands
living
inside
right now.
and out.
Oh, awesome.
When we come
Excellent,
back,
man.
we'll look at a hearing in the case
Excellent.
of
Likewise, glad to have you
Robert.
guys out, man. Appreciate it, guys. How you doing? Excellent.
Your life is going to be the protest. When you go to work, you need to talk about the things that you've seen out there. When you go to work, I need you to talk about the footsteps that you took when you were out there on the plaza. I need the first responders that helped innocent victims that were maced, that were fight, percussion bombs, that were pouring milk on people's face. You have a story, and your story is your protest. Only until you take your protest past these lines. Listen, if today is the only day you protest, you have failed. If this weekend is the only day that you have protest, you have failed. I laid on the corner of 27th and Montgomery, hands behind my back, beaten, kicked. Listen, I got scars on my face right now for being kicked in the face. They told me to stop resisting. I had my hands behind my back. I almost did 35 years in the federal penitentiary. I served 90 months for a low-level drug offense. The judicial system is infected with a virus called racism. Our housing market is infected with a virus called racism. Our police are infected with a virus called racism. And as long as that virus continues to spread, it's like COVID-19. But this virus ain't scared. It ain't telling you to wear a mask. It'll just stand on somebody's neck for 9 minutes on live TV for the world to see and have no remorse. 9 minutes! If you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, don't let today be your last day. Don't let today be your only moment. No, we're not all politicians. We're not all 501c3 owners. No. But we all have a story. God has gifted each person with a story to tell. Your camera has now been your weapon. Your voice, your hashtag is now your weapon. Your friendship, listen, and I'm gonna be done. White mothers, white fathers, what are you gonna tell your kids? What's the narrative? How are you going to teach your kids and raise your kids moving forward? We all know that rhetoric goes on. We're not going to hide from it. But what we have to do is have a sake of empathy. Because guess what? These mothers, that mother that lost her child, she didn't ask for her child to be in the front of a protest. She didn't ask for that. Mike Brown's mother, she didn't ask to be the advocate of a nationwide movement. She didn't ask for that. So you have to train your children. You have to prepare the next generation because guess what? They're the policy holders of the future. They're the police officers of the future. The police system isn't bad, but it's infected with racism. Our political system isn't wrong, but it's infected with racism. if you train them when they're young, if they take those positions, their cognitions, the way that they think, the way that they breathe, the way that they move, will go into those positions, and they will make the policies and changes that we need as a people. Today we stand because we demand change. What do we demand? What do we demand? What do we want? What are we not leaving here until we get?
What a force, what an amazing job he's been doing, and an inspiration, and just thankful for this. And thank you all for showing up. Give yourselves a hand for showing up here today to demand more, to demand that we enact the change that so desperately we need. I struggled with what I wanted to say today, and it's a difficult thing to talk about, and especially when I think back of my history textbooks, at least the ones that I saw when I was a kid, were whitewashed. And we were led to believe that because the North won the Civil War and slavery was in our distant past, that we've been eternal. That ain't right. Thank you. We didn't learn about the direct through line from the Civil War, from the antebellum South, through the racist housing policies of the North that continued to further disadvantage our communities of color and our black lives. One of the first memories I have of an uprising in regards as a result of the brutal beating of Rodney King. I didn't understand that protest was not just about the beating, but the fact that those officers who brutally beat him were absolved of all wrongdoing. And I watch all the protests going on across the nation, and I'm optimistic that this is really a different time. But I'm not the one to say that. It's not about me. I look over the crowd, and I'm impressed with the turnout, and I need to talk to my fellow white folks out there. This isn't enough. Are you tired? Well, drink some coffee and perk up, people. We have a job to do as white allies in this movement. And I'm going to ask the same question the previous speaker asked, which is, white parents, what are you telling your kids about this? I am reckoning with that right now with a 6-year-old trying to explain to him what systematic racism is. White folks, get with it, let's do this. Be more than allies. Your Black Lives Matter. Absolutely. But it's not an ideology or a political agenda. And for, again, my white folks out there, it's not a hashtag for you to put out on social media to absolve yourself of the role you play in a racist, oppressive system. So it doesn't end here. Your role does not end here. Our black brothers and black sisters have been crying for our help for generations. It's time to get to work for real. I've watched protests on TV and in person, and I've seen videos of unnecessary escalation on the part of law enforcement. I've seen men and women get brutalized with rubber bullets and tear gas. That ain't right. We have to demand change, and it starts right here. And I'll be honest with you that simple reform to law enforcement isn't enough. We spend as a city 10 times the amount on law enforcement as we do on public health. And we all know that we are in the middle of a global pandemic. A at a rate so disproportionate that it's inhuman. And we've called you out here in this crowd in the middle of a pandemic, and thank you for doing it. Thank you for putting your health at risk. It has to happen. We spend 10 times the amount on law enforcement as we do on public health. Let that sink in. And that's the same at the state and national level as well. Public health is a way to police our cities and without the heavy hand of brutal law enforcement that we've seen in so many of our videos. Public health is a way of the future of enforcement and making our communities safe and whole. Public safety, not policing, not law enforcement. We're not going to get there overnight. But we need to start taking a different approach. We need to look at trauma-informed care, because the folks who've been living in the east side of the city have experienced trauma that white folks, you and me, we haven't experienced. And white folks, we need to get real about that. That trauma that they've experienced results in the crime that we see. We have to do better. We have to take a public health approach to public safety. We have to give access to health care.
I'm going to kind of walk the Lafayette perimeter. I just want to see.
We gotta get Medicaid expansion passed here in a few months. That's not enough. That's not enough. The protests that we've seen across the country have not only resulted in public cries from the community, from the organizers, from your voices, but tangible results are coming of it. People are talking about the complete systems change that is required for law enforcement to do right by our communities and make us safer and not fear them. Look at what's happening in Minneapolis. My counterparts in Minneapolis are calling for a complete undoing of how we do law enforcement and public safety. It's not going to happen overnight. We're taking some important steps. I think you probably heard the mayor thankfully talk yesterday about the last couple of days talking about body cameras. We got to have body cameras on every single officer, right? We got to make sure that they stay on. And we got to make sure you have access to that footage, because we can't rely on innocent bystanders to take video on their cell phones. Sometimes those innocent bystanders are charged with crimes themselves. You've got to hold them accountable, but we have to have them held accountable as well. They have to hold themselves accountable. That's not enough. We also need local control of our police department. We've got to get the control of our police department back in City Hall and out of the governor's mansion. We've seen the leadership that comes from the governor in response to COVID-19. We've seen that. And if that's what we have to look forward to, then we need to bring that back here so that the people of Kansas City, have the ability to make these changes. And in the long run, all that stuff that law enforcement reform isn't enough. We have to rethink how public safety works. The very people who are entrusted to protect your freedom of speech, a right guaranteed to you by the Constitution of the United States, are sometimes the ones you're most angry about. And if they're the ones in charge of protecting your freedom of speech, we have to rethink how this thing works. And I was talking to my wife the other day about, I was saying, with systematic racism and especially in law enforcement, that it's broken. And she said, no, it's not broken. It never worked. If it's never worked for our communities, then it can't be broken. So I'm standing up here today as a city council member, as an elected official, to represent you right here in this building. We meet every Thursday to pass laws. We passed a few good ones yesterday. I'm here standing not only in solidarity for a promise to change, promise to bring change to the city, an ally, and if I get tired, give me some coffee and get back to the curb. Thank you so much.
I'm not quite sure what's so less threatening today for the park police than other days. Like, there's no one really out. I don't know how many people are in vehicles or in buildings back there, but there's no readiness that I see for anything. And the crowd is basically the same as yesterday. The fence line has not changed. The fence is exactly the same as it was yesterday. I don't see any additional reinforcement compared to yesterday. Somebody asked me to go across the road. What do you mean to go across the road? Like across the street? Vermont is open to pedestrian traffic. Only a DC cruiser is stopping traffic on H on both sides of the protest. Asking me to show a picture of a burger guy. I'll just scan this side of the street. Everybody is safe. I don't see anything threatening out there at all from either side, from either protesters or from park police. No problem. know if there's anybody who's watching the weather. I'm looking off to the west, and I don't see as much. I don't see as many storm clouds. I still do see storm clouds north of where I'm at, but not really seeing much in the way of rain coming from this point. That's good. Rain happening at 1 will be fine by me. I'll take the break.
We need to change it. We need to fight it. We need to know that we're not going to stand for it anymore. And so let me tell you something. I know people asking me, well, Lucas, what you doing? You can say, Lucas, what you doing? That's a good question. So yesterday, we changed policies that hadn't been changed for years. We made it so that any use of force violation needs to be reviewed by an outside agency, not a department itself. We changed it so any, and I mean any, officer-involved shooting needs to be investigated by an outside agency, not just a department. And this is why we have to work with our prosecutor, because let me tell you something. If I walk out on the street today and I shoot you, I don't get to wait 3 weeks for an investigation. I usually don't get to go home, right? We need to make sure that not only do we have accountability, but we have speed with that accountability. So what else do we need to do? Well, when we talk about shaking up the foundation, look at these. These are some strong buildings. They are sturdy, but we need to shake them up too. We need to make sure that y'all are not just with me today, and you're not just pushing us today. You're pushing us next week, next month, next year, the year after, because we're going to make sure we make change. But let me tell you something. If Sister Barbara didn't say it, then I know all my council members would have too. The revolution, my friends, will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. They want to put you on the news when you're protesting. They don't want to put you on the news when you're teaching a young black child. They don't want to put us on the news when we're trying to change our community. Well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to keep making the news. We're going to make it so they know that we demand accountability. And you know how we make that accountability? We all just show up. We all just come. We show up to the next police board meeting and say, we here. We show up to the next city council meeting. And what do we say? We're here. We show up to the governor's office and we say what? We're here. That's how we're going to make a difference. So let me just tell you this. I'm not talking about as a mayor right now. I'm a black man my whole life, been a mayor for 10 months. And I will tell you this still. Whenever I see any of these stories, and it's something I usually don't even want to talk about, because that pain that so many of our black speakers have talked about is something that every black person in this audience knows. You know that when you see a brother who is kneeled on and killed based on a forgery charge, you know that when you see a brother who stopped and tried to get his license but ends up shot and dead, you know that that could be you. You know that that could be your brother, your sister, your auntie, your uncle, your nephew, your niece, your son, and your daughter. And what we are making these changes for today, and I want y'all, and I know we've been talking about protesting, some of y'all don't even have peace with me. That's all right, because what are we fighting for right now? I'm thinking about the brother right now at 40. I'm thinking about the brother right now at 87. I'm thinking about the brother right now who stays off the way. That's what we fight for. We fight so they can live. We fight so they can breathe. We fight so they can live. We fight so they can burn with it. So I see all your signs. We're going to keep our movement going. Do Lucha, ask me Lucha. What we're saying to everybody is, we are going to make sure that when we are done, these foundations have been shaken. We have changed the way it looks. Living in Kansas City doesn't mean we just go along to get along. Living in Kansas City doesn't mean we're accepting the same stuff anymore. Living in Kansas City means that we can demand justice, and living in Kansas City means that we have the power to make change. And I need all of y'all to know you got the power. Say, I got the power. Say, I got the power. Because we all do. So I need you. I'm going to look back at y'all. I know you ain't going to be behind me when I walk up these steps in a few days, but I want to feel that you're going to be there. The next time I'm meeting with the governor, I want to be able to say, look, governor, you may be elected from a different place in Missouri. You may think all these things. You may like Trump. I don't care, 'cause I got my people with me. So what I've been hearing all week is that y'all are ready. Now, y'all not just ready. You demand change. Is that right? You demand change. So if we demand change, and I'm going to just do this, will be the last thing I'll say. If we demand change, if you worried about my brother and sister, if you worried about the next person who's running into trouble being safe, if you worried about fairness and equality, if you want to shake the foundation of the Jackson County Courthouse, of Kansas City City Hall, of the police headquarters, Eastern Kansas City, everywhere around here, if you want to change, I want to hear it. Make more noise than you have ever thought of. Make sure everybody hears it. Let's roll.
Although this is an inch, we still have a mile walk. This is why we protest. We're the only city that's protest that's actually gotten policy change and came together to demand that our community will change. This is a movement of the people. I'm here. I'll put you in.
We don't have resources. We don't have jobs. We don't have the kids we got their
Homeless folk have been left behind, neglected, to just die out.
Since the virus started, the number of people has increased a lot.
There's not just 12, 20 people was in the street when we're against the trans.
Look at it. What the gentrification they do. Luxury apartments and then the rents go sky high. The homeless population here in New York City is growing. Every day it grows. After this COVID-19, I won't be surprised that it grows even more.
In the prosecutorial chain must be strong. It needs to be strong because trying this case will not be an easy thing. Winning a conviction will be hard. In fact, County Attorney Freeman is the only prosecutor in the state of Minnesota who has successfully convicted a police officer for murder. And he can tell you that it's hard. I say this not because we doubt our resources or our ability. In fact, we're confident in what we're doing. But history does show that there are clear challenges here.
As we take this larger, turning from Chris's story to look at the militarization of the police force, the American Civil Liberties Union, Black Lives Matter, announced Thursday they're suing President Trump and Attorney General William Barr for authorizing a, quote, unprovoked and frankly criminal attack on protesters. That in Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C., where the National Guard and officers dressed in riot gear fired tear gas, rubber bullets, and flashbangs to disperse peaceful protesters on Monday, so Trump could have his photo taken with a Bible in front of St. John's Episcopal Church. The bishop there criticized him, said it was completely inappropriate that they should use their church, that Trump should use their church as a backdrop. The lawsuit alleges the Trump administration violated protesters' constitutional rights of free speech and assembly. For more, we're going to Baltimore, Maryland, to speak with Stuart Schrader, Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins University. University, author of the book Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. Welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk, Stuart, about this militarization of police?
Yeah. I think what we're seeing right now with the protests is a convergence of what I would consider three trends. The first is a long-term trend of police being trained to treat political protest and agitation as almost tantamount to a revolutionary situation, and therefore understanding their job of controlling protests is basically defending the republic. This has a long history. I covered in my book. It goes back throughout the 20th century. I think we can apply the term counterinsurgency to this, meaning that we're seeing a combination of social and political power being used to control political protest in addition to police power, even in the absence of a real insurgency or a real revolutionary situation. This is a long-standing trend. Another trend is what most of us would refer to as the militarization of policing. That means the use of military-style body armor and helmets, military-style trucks that are, heavily armored, and of course the scary-looking military-style weaponry. Now, this type of material being in the hands of police increased after September 11th, 2001, but in the 1990s, under President Bill.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Thursday, disturbing new details were revealed in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, the 25-year-old black man chased, ambushed, shot dead by a group of white men in Georgia in what many have called a modern-day lynching. In a nearly 7-hour hearing, a state judge concluded all three men, Travis McMichael, his father, former police officer Gregory McMichael, and William Roddy Bryan, would stand trial for Ahmaud Arbery's murder after Special Agent Richard Dial of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation testified Travis McMichael used a racial slur after shooting and killing Arbery.
Said that after the shooting took place, before police arrival, while Mr. Arbery was on the ground, that he heard Travis McMichael make the statement.
Those last two words were the F word and the N word. Travis McMichael had a sticker of a Confederate flag on his truck's toolbox. The investigator, Richard Dial, also testified the three white men hit Arbery with a truck as he attempted to escape them. Special Prosecutor Jesse Evans said Arbery was chased, hunted down, and ultimately executed. Arbery's family is calling for all three men arrested to face federal hate crime charges as well. For more, we're going to Georgia, to Atlanta, where we're joined by Carol Anderson, professor.
That show how fucked up cops are than this. So this happened in Burbank, California. I was given the heads up by the owner of the Burbank, California Comedy Club, Flappers. He was there. Dave Reinitz told me about this. A black family tried to get the attention of police to protect a neighborhood store in Van Nuys, which is in the West Valley, not in Burbank. In Van Nuys, and were immediately handcuffed. You want to see this? Watch this. This is awesome. And watch how the cops talk to the news person.
They're trying to flag them down. We're trying to flag down the cops. Oh. Hold on, let me flag them back here. They're driving past us. Oh. Stop.
Because there are people trying to loot their store, and they're trying to protect it. And the looters are there. They got a car.
It just goes to show you perhaps how overwhelmed the police department is right now.
This is one of
They
the...
have gone up and down the street. Okay, they're turning around. There they come. There they come. They just saw me.
Oh, so you think it's all over? It's just starting.
In 3 days of surreal moments on TV, this is one of the most surreal moments we've seen. What is underway right now in Van Nuys. All right, so here come the police officers to help these community members.
The guys on the other side are in cars. All right.
So she just told every one of those cops. A news reporter said they're trying to loot the store. The guys in the cars on the other side. She just told them. Watch what the cops do. This is awesome.
And here they come. The guys here are trying to stop over there from looting in the cars. All right, now they're telling them, no, they're fine.
They're good.
Oh, gosh. Oh, gosh.
No. Whoa.
Oh, my God. Joe, to your right. Come on. He's with us. He is with me. Sir.
They're fucking with the press. And then they start arresting the people who own the store. Watch this.
They're okay, sir. They're the store owners. They were protecting the looters, sir.
Whoa.
They're protecting the store. The looters are over there.
Stand down for a sec, please.
Please
Shut up and let us keep doing the thing that you're upset about, please. Shut up and let us keep doing the wrong thing.
We don't need the facts.
What the fuck? Kind of there's a news person with a microphone and a camera telling you something. Shut up. Let us go fuck shit up. And of course he's got a mustache.
You're losing your looters. They're going down that way. These are the people in the store trying to stop.
Point. All three of them. Okay, we're putting those in handcuffs right now.
You don't
Moron! Do they hire the dumbest people who take the test? I think they do. I think they hire the dumbest mouth breathers who take the cop test. Do you see how easy it is to make 80, 90 grand a year?
March appears to be turning south on 13th off of K.
No, but that security guard, he chased us for 3 blocks. Yes, ma'am, but why is he arresting him? Okay. All right, let me just get a little bit, like 30 more seconds, and I'm out. They really arrested my cousin, bro. I don't know what to do, chat. He told me to go home, so it looks like the police... I got it on video. Hey! That's my cousin, bro. That's my cousin. Hey, that's my cousin, bro. They arrested my cousin and shit.
When you need it, Jack delivers. Order on Uber Eats, Postmates, and Grubhub.
The only change we can create is to boycott. We have to stop spending money for people to understand because the economy runs everything. Everything. Boycott everything. Tomorrow, TI. Around 4 for a boycott. No spending, no money.
Correct. This is true. Thank y'all for watching this broadcast. We are live on the Rhode Island State House lawn side. Numerous of people. There's at least 200 to 300 people here on side and on the streets walking this direction. We're gonna walk further down the You guys have the time by any chance? Minutes out from the curfew. The military is actually over here alongside state police. We are 30 minutes out, or a couple of minutes out. I'm not sure if this guy is an organizer or what, but he seems to be talking. Seems peaceful.
marchers appear to be turning east on Pennsylvania, so they're probably going to the Capitol. Several DC police moving through Chinatown, trying to stay ahead of the march.
African Americans, they're in a gray vehicle. The other gray vehicle is parked in front of the Buy Gold store.
They're still fucking with those people.
A group of six of them.
They're handcuffing them.
African. Okay. They have nothing. They have nothing to do.
I need you to relax. I need you to relax. I need you to relax.
The out-of-control female, you need to relax reporting the facts right now while you're on live television.
You're busy brutalizing people and uncuffing the wrong people, but they need to relax.
People were protecting the store.
Care about them. The looters that walked away. Looters that walked away. Which one?
I don't care that we're fucking with people. The looter! And he just starts
And then
screaming.
he starts yelling at her. He's able to stay controlled.
Yeah, he just got done telling her to calm down.
And I would have to say it's at least one.
Do they hire the dumbest guy? So the biggest asshole you went to high school with, that's him. The biggest assholes you went to high school with, there they are. There they are. Where they are, they're there. Every dick you ever fucking wanted to get away from in high school, they give them a gun and a badge, and that's where they are. That's awesome.
Where did they go?
Your officers are following them. They went south.
Okay. Car. What kind?
Gray.
Does not care that they're arresting the owners. He doesn't, couldn't care.
There's nothing unusual about that, at least given the current situation.
So ask yourself this: how does the United States government treat individuals who they view as terrorists? Well, I think if you're watching this, you are informed enough to know the answer to that question. We indefinitely detain them. We murder them. So when the President of the United States takes to Twitter and he designates Antifa as a terrorist organization, what are the implications of that? Well, clearly, if this is a terrorist organization, that gives the United States government a justification to treat them as terrorists. Deny them habeas corpus, deny them constitutional rights, and kill them extrajudicially, if need be. So a lot of people, I think, kind of scoffed at that designation on Twitter, but I do believe it's dangerous because it is inciting violence against anyone the United States government views as Antifa. Now, I've explained this before, but to say that Antifa is an organization doesn't really make sense. It's like saying environmentalists is an organization. Sure, there are environmental groups, but to paint Antifa with a broad brush when that label refers to people who are anti-fascist doesn't necessarily make sense. But he did this because he wants to have some sort of justification, legally speaking, to treat them as terrorists. Terrorists don't get rights, therefore we treat you like the terrorists that you are under the view of the United States. And as soon as Donald Trump said this, well, of course, the far-right extremists currently in our government, sitting members of Congress, started to incite violence against Antifa. Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz literally asked on Twitter why we can't hunt them like we do the terrorists in the Middle East. Let me rephrase that if you don't know why that's so outrageous. He asked why we can't hunt United States citizens like we do terrorists in the Middle East. Deny them due process. Kill them extrajudicially. That's what he asked. Now, Donald Trump, by designating Antifa as a terrorist organization and then priming people to believe that Antifa is actually fueling these uprisings, well, when he threatens to use the U.S. military against these protesters, what is he trying to do? He is trying to get you to think that the U.S. military is fighting terrorists. That's what it does. It's not changing the way that it functions. The U.S. military has always been fighting terrorists, right? We've been doing this war on terror since a lot of people who are now old enough to vote have been born, right? So it's not really a change, when in actuality this is a change. To use the U.S. military against U.S. citizens is completely unacceptable and unconstitutional. So that's why this designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization is unacceptable. And it also doesn't make sense. But there are individuals within government who are far right, who are using Trump's designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization to incite violence against U.S. citizens. And before we get to Tom Cotton's op-ed in the New York Times, well, fewer people knew that he literally advocated for the murder of Antifa members online. He says there should be no quarter for insurrectionists, anarchists, rioters, and looters, which means they should be extrajudicially murdered by the state. Because if you're saying no quarter, well, this is a military term. That means we just kill them. We don't capture them, we kill them. That's what Tom Cotton, a United States Senator, is saying about rioters, looters, insurrectionists, anarchists, people who might fall under the category of Antifa. So we now have multiple lawmakers advocating for the extrajudicial murder of U.S. citizens after the United States president threatened to use the military to violently crush protests around the country. You have to understand the gravity of this situation and how serious that is. Whatever your political predisposition may be, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, right? Because if you're not allowed to vocalize your policy preferences in a way where you protest, if the government is going to use the military, if we establish that as a precedent, well, then you're not going to get anything you want ever again. So this is very serious. And you have people like Tom Cotton who are now cheering on Donald Trump as he threatens to use the military. He published an op-ed, or the New York Times published his op-ed, and it's titled, "Send in the Troops. The Nation Must Restore Order. The Military Stands Ready." And in this op-ed, he explicitly calls for an overwhelming show of force to crush the rebellion. So let's recap. After this United States Senator said there should be no quarter for these people, he then said, let's call in the U.S. military. This is a declaration of war against the American people. They're saying we're going to treat American citizens who we deem unworthy enough like we do terrorists. No due process, no habeas corpus in some instances, if you go to New York State, for example. We're going to extrajudicially kill them. Why? Because we say that they're terrorists. So listen to us and take us at our word. This is dangerous. And the Republican Party has already been an extremist party. They've already been a proto-fascist party for quite some time, but we're watching them transition from a proto-fascist party to a violently fascist party. Because when you start threatening violence against your own population and following through on that, when you have police departments around the country using chemical weapons against United States citizens, we are officially entering fascist territory, right? It's not just fear-mongering and alarmist rhetoric. We are in fascist territory. Again, a United States senator is calling for an action that could instigate a civil war, pit the U.S. military against the very people that it's supposed to protect. And this is a brazen violation of the U.S. Constitution, because think about this, once the government does this, once the government steps in and crushes protests with the military, well, people will start to slowly but surely accept this as a normal thing, like we accept spying as a normal thing, like we accepted torture as a normal thing during the Bush years. So once we get to that point, all hope is lost. You want Medicare for all, and you think that taking to the streets is the only way to get it? Well, now there's precedent, if this happens, where the military can crush you. It's deeply dangerous. And my worry is that we will accept this, because we kind of are accepting this, right? Like, I'm talking about it. Some of you online may have vocalized anger over this, and there's been a lot of pushback about the fact that the New York Times even published this Goons article. But the fact that we're not protesting outside of their offices after individuals like Matt Gaetz and Tom Cotton said we should kill Americans extrajudicially, that shows us that we might actually accept this. We might just sit idly by as the military steps in and crushes this protest. This is literally tyranny. This is the definition of the First Amendment being violated. This is fascism. And every single person should be shaken to their core if they care about free speech right now. We're not talking about college students protesting certain speakers. We're talking about an actual threat to the First Amendment. We're talking about an escalation so serious that the U.S. government may use the military against citizens. Unacceptable. And anyone who stands idly by, silently, who just allows this to happen without speaking up, you know, maybe they like Donald Trump and they trust him, so they don't necessarily see this as an issue currently. I promise you that if you don't care now, if he follows through with this, you're going to care one day when a Democrat takes office and tries to crush a protest with the military. Because once we say this is okay as a country, then we tacitly give the government permission to do that. It's why they spy on us constantly. Do you understand? So this is deeply, deeply important that we all pay attention currently. Now, here's the thing. What oftentimes acts as a check on government tyranny, or should theoretically be a check on government tyranny, is the media. But guess what the New York Times did? They published the op-ed from Tom Cotton where he literally advocated for the U.S. government to crush these protesters. The New York Times should be going out of their way to act as a check on the tyranny that we're seeing currently. But what are they doing? They're aiding and abetting the fascists currently, who are out of control. But it's not the first time that the New York Times has done this. Aided and abetted fascists, platformed fascists. Because on June 22nd of 1941, they published an excerpt from Mein Kampf. Yes, you heard that correctly, Mein Kampf, in an article titled The Art of Propaganda by Adolf Hitler. Now, the attempt to justify this was that, this was published for educational purposes. Since Germany wanted to wage a quote-unquote psychological war on the United States, the editors likely thought that this insight into Hitler's thinking would be insightful for American readers, although the problem with this is if you just publish something uncritically without actually challenging it, it could have the opposite effect. Now, this isn't the first time that the New York Times, rather than actually pushing back against the government tyranny, has platformed it and signal boosted for it. As Nathan J. Robinson of Current Affairs points out, they published an op-ed advocating for the bombing of North Korea, as well as the bombing of Iran, written of course by John Bolton, and they even published a piece by Blackwater's Eric Prince advocating for the privatization of war. Now I'm going to link you to Nathan J. Robinson's article in Current Affairs. I think that he does a really good job going through why, this was a horrible idea for the New York Times to publish this op-ed by Tom Cotton. But the backlash to this actually made me feel a little bit optimistic. Not a lot, but just a little bit, because there was some pushback from people who actually worked at the New York Times, saying this puts their black writers at risk. And it forced the editor to come out and actually respond. Now, his response was absolutely terrible. He basically makes the generic argument that, if you want to counter bad ideas, then you just need more good ideas, bro. And, I mean, he basically implies that this was meant to be educational, even though he disagrees with Cotton's rationale. And let me just say, the same justification he used for publishing this is the same justification that they used to publish Adolf Hitler in 1941. Well, this is educational. No, if you want to get insight into an opinion that you view as deeply problematic, that is objectively unconstitutional, then you can't just publish it uncritically. You have to challenge it. If you're going to platform it, you have to actually subject it to scrutiny. Otherwise, people aren't going to view this as something crazy. A lot of people are going to read Tom Cotton's op-ed and think, wow, this makes sense, and it's published in the New York Times. So this is a legitimate argument that a reputable news source has published. So do you understand the problem with this? Now look, the New York Times can publish whatever they want to. They are a private company. But the irony embedded in all of this is that the same amendment, the First Amendment that Tom Cotton is attacking, is the same amendment that allows the New York Times to exist. Freedom of speech, free press, these are all interconnected issues. So the fact that they published this, I mean, shame on them. If you're going to publish this, then challenge it, right? Don't just allow a United States senator to suggest that we should violate the Constitution in a brazen manner. You're supposed to be a check on government tyranny. You're not supposed to assist them in their quest to gaslight and brainwash citizens. You're supposed to be the check. You're supposed to be the force that stops that, the fourth estate. So what I would encourage you to do, if you read the New York Times and you are a paid member, unsubscribe. I canceled my subscription. I was only the basic $4 a month subscriber because I sometimes will use them as a source when I do the show. I canceled and I let them know it was because of the Tom Cotton op-ed that they published, and they shouldn't aid and abet fascists as they literally help our government become more and more fascistic, right? I'm not going to support any institution or any organization that assists the fascists in their takeover of government and American life. Now I'm going to leave you with the wise words of Marianne Williamson, who writes, "The opinion editor of the New York Times should publicly apologize at the very least. Publishing Tom Cotton's op-ed was not just publishing a different opinion. It gave voice to a call for the military takeover of the United States of America. WTF doesn't even begin to cover it." And that's exactly it. WTF does not even begin to cover it, and if people don't grasp the seriousness of this, the scope of this moment and what it's going to require from us to overcome it, then we are in a lot more trouble than we think.
Lives matter. All lives matter should go without saying. Hashtag it's sadly, disappointingly necessary.
Police
today,
have launched a review after a protest captured in a dramatic viral picture told the Sun how cops fired weapons around him and his 2-year-old son, and one officer allegedly threatened to spray tear gas at the little boy. Do you see this, images? A 2-year-old has a gun pointed at him by California Long Beach police. A 2-year-old. I mean, this is absolutely reprehensible. This is absolutely reprehensible. What is this police officer thinking? Do you know how traumatizing that would be for a 2-year-old to have a gun pointed in their head? In an exclusive interview on Wednesday, Dante, the boy's father, told how one officer threatened to spray tear gas while others fired bullets right in front of them. And in video footage shared with the Sun, cops could be seen loading weapons and firing bullets all around them, while in another, fellow protesters could be heard begging cops not to gas the child. shouting, "What's the matter with you? You are a monster. You're really going to gas this child? What about your child?" Now Long Beach Police Department have responded to the claims, labeling them disturbing and pledging to launch a review. In a statement, a spokesperson said, "The Long Beach Police Department is aware of this image posted to social media of a crowd control police officer and a man with a child on his shoulder during Sunday's civil unrest. We agree the image is disturbing, and we all share the community's concerns for the safety of the child, the peaceful demonstrators, and the officers. While the review of the incident is underway, we do know that this image was taken at the time that violent disruptors were throwing bottles and pyrotechnics that could cause great bodily injury to anyone in the area. We are reviewing all of the related footage, blah, 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 blah." So, Jen, I'm beginning to see a pattern. Not just with police departments, but with governors, state lawmakers. I keep hearing, "Oh, we're investigating. Oh, we're doing a review. So-and-so police department is, launched an inquiry into it." All of this is amount to nothing. They're not investigating because they're investigating themselves. That's why more and more people are starting to say, well, we need independent agencies to investigate the police. Not the local district attorney who works with the police on a daily basis, trying criminals. But what is there to investigate? Like, yeah, you could look at the video, but the picture is right there. That officer was firing, had a gun pointed at a 2-year-old. Now, some people debated, well, that guy shouldn't bring his 2-year-old to a protest. I don't agree with that. Why shouldn't he bring his 2-year-old to a protest? That very assumption is why America is so messed up. Because people say, well, protests could be dangerous, so don't bring your toddler. Protests aren't supposed to be dangerous. And 95% of these protesters are peaceful all around the country. But I don't think this police department is going to investigate. I think this police department, like Chicago Police Department, like New York Police Department, says words. We've opened a review, an inquiry, a this, a that, and eventually they'll say, oh, we found that, the officer was pointing elsewhere, or that, people were throwing things at the officer. Just throwing out things that nobody could disprove to excuse this behavior. What do you think?
I completely agree. The protest was billed as peaceful. He's bringing his son there because he is under systemic oppression. He wants his son to live in a more just world. Of course he can bring his son to this protest. Of course his son can hold a Black Lives Matter sign or whatever they want to do. That is their right. I really think it was interesting yesterday, Jordan, one of the young men that you interviewed brought up the Stanford prison experiment. So you talk about why are cops aiming this, I don't know what it was exactly, a rubber bullet gun or something, some kind of weapon. Why are they aiming this at a 2-year-old? Why are they aiming this at peaceful protesters at all? And the Stanford prison experiment showed that people who are given roles of power, roles of authority, can easily take on an authoritarian, power-hungry, disgusting, abusive mindset. And that's what these cops are in. And we have these, the people of the streets, the regular people of this country who are dealing with this violence and dealing with this disgusting behavior by police all over the place. And if cameras weren't there to catch this stuff, and typically they aren't. So this happens all the time. And I think you're right. This internal review or whatever it is won't show anything. They'll say, oh, that photo's just a camera angle, which right-wingers are already trying to disprove the photo. Honestly, I don't care about camera angles. What I care about is the fact that at this peaceful protest to this young, Black 2-year-old child, a cop did that, pointed in his direction. It's just abhorrent. And
I want to play, maybe you guys have seen some of these clips elsewhere, but if you haven't, Here's some more best hits of what the police have been doing the last few days. That one was in Pennsylvania, where literally a woman was kneeling on the ground. She was on the ground, and a cop just kicked her in the face. That's another one where that local Pennsylvania police department said, oh, yeah, we're investigating the matter. What in God's name would you have to investigate? For example, Jen, my parents own a jewelry store, right? If one of their salespeople punched a customer in the face that was like, I don't know, just sitting on the little seat that you sit on when you're like looking at an engagement ring, just like punched them in the face, they'd be fired like immediately. So why is it any different for police? Actually, the police should be terminated more quickly than in private business because we pay their bill. I don't know if you were able to see that, but the way that this cop kicked this protester in the face, her neck could have snapped back. I mean, the force of that guy, they're wearing boots. It's not like you're hitting someone with little slippers. You know, the full force of this guy, her neck could have snapped back. God knows what could have happened to that person. They're investigating it. Where in any other situation that wasn't U.S. police, that person would be fired.
Cops are supposed to serve and protect the people of this country. That is their role. What was that cop thinking? Except for, I am powerful and I'm going to cause as much pain to this person in front of me as possible. This dirty protester, whatever they were thinking. It's or maybe they weren't thinking at all. They're just violent. They've turned into these. I mean, it's what would normally be a movie, but is our reality. These just evil authoritarian figures who are violent and just despicable. I did see the video, kicking that girl in the face who was already down, who was just sitting there. There's no excuse for it. And as for an internal review, there's video. There's nothing to review. It's, as you say, in any other job, that person would be out immediately. So what is taking so long? What is
that? I know a lot of people have seen this, but I'm bringing this up because we have a few words for New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. So for those that haven't seen it, this is, I think it was like 5-6 days ago. This is, protesters were surrounding a police vehicle. They weren't like jumping on the vehicle, but surrounding a police vehicle. Let's look at what happens. Not only in any other line of work, in any other line of anything, if there were a bunch of people surrounding a car, sure, we could debate whether protesters should be getting up so close to a car like that. Maybe they felt, threatened or whatever. But there's different ways you could handle that, right? You could call for backup. You could get on your police megaphone and say, please back up from the car. We'd like to give you your right to protest, but, back up from the car. You cannot surround our car. If it continues, you'll be arrested immediately. So a cop car runs over, it looked like a couple dozen people. In any other scenario, not only would they be fired, they'd be charged with attempted something. I mean, you could kill somebody, that people could be dragged under that car. It's just unbelievable. Meanwhile, Mayor Bill de Blasio, a Democrat, at a press conference, kind of like, did a little Trump Charlottesville about this, said, oh, well, good people on both sides. I mean, he didn't say that, but he basically said, yes, we are going to, again, investigate this incident, but the cops shouldn't be surrounding the car. It's still, I think 5 or 6 days later, those officers haven't been fired that ran over protesters. Think about, by the way, this isn't only a race thing. I don't want to say that as a white person because obviously there's a huge racial dynamic. It's not only a race thing with this police terrorism. It is a power, an outsized power complex. Police have been fetishized in this country. The deference that has been given not only to corporate America, but to police, who they're not all bad, but the psychology that the United States government has put out there about police is we should bow down to police officers, and they are holier than thou, and that, you know, they could do no wrong, and blah, 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 when the reality is we pay for them, and they don't get to terrorize people because they have a badge or because their job is a little, is risky. You know what I mean? Journalists' jobs are risky, maybe not as risky as police, but we don't get to go run people over. You know, we don't get to shoot guns at point a gun at a toddler. I mean, it's crazy. And the fact that, you know, if this were the only incident right now, remember, if there wasn't George Floyd, if there wasn't Breonna Taylor, if there wasn't Ahmaud Arbery, if there wasn't protests all over the country, and it was just this on a random New York City night where police like rammed their car over a bunch of people, it would be national news for days, or it should be national news for days. But it's being lost in the rest of it.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.
Who do you think you are?
I don't think
You think you're something special? Pakistan. I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
No wonder the Indians are bombing you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Exactly. You're never going to win that battle.
No problem.
This is England, and you're in a job in England.
That's it.
So respect this country that you're in.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, I will put this on Facebook, sir. Don't worry. And more people will see you. What you're saying, because people can see your face as well. So you know you very soon, because don't worry, sir.
Do you really think I give a
don't worry, sir.
Listen.
I don't even listen, sir.
Well, I'll tell you what about
wars. We're not here competition.
Wars will blow you out the f***ing water.
Thank you, don't worry.
Again, this is the front page of the HuffPo. New Yorker said enough, so the police rioted. And this is written by a senior reporter at HuffPo, and he goes into it. It's really remarkable. Again, there are so many over-the-top stories of police brutality, you just can't believe it. So many. And so much so that Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, castigated the police and Mayor de Blasio for not doing... people were looting on Fifth Avenue. They're looting the rich parts of Manhattan while the cops were cracking heads of peaceful protesters. Why weren't the cops protecting the businesses? Why do I not see one video of cops smacking the heads of looters? Why do I never see that video? Every video is cops cracking the heads of peaceful protesters or journalists. So here's the...
or arresting the shopkeepers.
Or arresting the shopkeepers, which we'll show you. Here is So after Cuomo, rightly so, pointed out that the New York cops and de Blasio did not do their job, he came on and said this.
Governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, as you know, yesterday lashed out at the police response, saying police essentially did not do their job on Monday night when there was widespread looting. He even talked about displacing the mayor and bringing in the National Guard. Is that necessary in your mind?
Absolutely not. I stated this yesterday that you'd have to come out and see what these men and women are doing. Don't ever call them ineffective. As a matter of fact, last night his office called and apologized to me. I know he called the commissioner directly to apologize that that's not what he meant, that he did not mean to put down the police officers. I'd hope he would come out publicly and say that again today during his press conference.
So these are police chiefs everywhere are having their heck of a job brownie moment. We all see Just like back during Hurricane Katrina, we saw that the federal government was messing that response up unbelievably. They didn't know what they were doing. Turns out they had put a guy in charge of FEMA that had no experience, didn't know what he was doing. His name was Brownie. And George Bush shows up in Louisiana and goes, hey, you're doing a heck of a job, Brownie. So that's what that's what this guy's doing. That's what this guy's doing. Cops are doing a great job. So they're just liars of the highest order. They're sociopaths. That guy's a sociopath. I don't care how many stars he puts on his collar or how many stars he puts on it. He's a criminal. And everybody who works in his organization are criminals. And by the way, not hyperbole. What he's doing is covering up for felonies and criminal cops. That makes him a criminal. And every other cop who covers up for other criminal cops makes them criminals.
That's all right. That's all right. That's their fear. Now they're afraid, as they should be, because we will keep...
Yeah, basically I'm a bloodthirsty sociopath, and I couldn't be prouder of the work these police officers have done.
Come back tomorrow. And come back the next day. And you know what?
When the New York PD was running protesters over, this guy wanted to give them a promotion for coming up with innovative weaponry. When this guy was taught about Kent State, he thought it was promotional material to become part of law enforcement. Oh, you get to kill college kids?
Because the men and women of this agency have done a remarkable job
of beating the shit out of defenseless, innocent protesters. They are doing a remarkable job. I'm going to guess this guy has a private position and a public position, just like his other buddies in government. Am I right?
In probably unprecedented times, and I couldn't be prouder of the work the men and women of this agency.
See, they're just psychopaths. Do I need to show you video after video? I can show you videos of New York cops running over people with their police cruisers. And he couldn't be prouder. These people are bloodthirsty sociopaths. Again, not even hyperbole a little. What we are living in and witnessing every day on TV is the most violent policing in the history of policing. It's happening in the United States. They're all trained by the Israelis. They're all given warrior training, and that training is not to protect you. That training is to make the citizen a second-class citizen and the enemy, and the first-class citizen is the police, and their number one job is to make sure that they come home safe. You ever heard cops say that? My number one job is to make sure I come home safe at night? That's not what the cop's job is supposed to be. When a cop thinks like that, that's when you get all these kind of police brutality. Because a cop is then saying, when he says it's my job to come home at night safe, that whatever I got to do to make that happen is going to happen. And if I got to kill you or run you over or crack your head, your life is secondary, my life is primary. And that's not what a cop is supposed to do. A cop is supposed to say, I am going to risk my life, put myself in between the bullet and you, Jimmy Dore, to save you. That's why I get a monopoly on violence, I get to carry a gun, and I get qualified immunity. That's what a cop is supposed to do, but they don't do that anymore. And it's not like, hey, they just randomly pluck people out of society. People are drawn to policing who are violent, who are steroided up, who come from the battlefield and military, and they love that shit. And if you don't, and if you're a good person who actually thinks you can help your community with a gun on your hip, they will either weed you out, get rid of you, or you will succumb to their violent culture. That's why there's no good cops. Do you understand what I'm saying by that? It's not good cops or bad cops. It's a cop culture. And if you don't fit in that culture, you leave or they kill you. That's how cops work. That's why it's not good cops, bad cops. When I look at those police riots, where there'll be 50, 60, 70 cops swinging batons at anybody who moves, innocent shooting journalists in the face, there's no good cops there, not one. There's no cop trying to stop their buddies from being violent maniacs, because they all are. Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?
we will repeat one more time American Revolution. And this is what you guys are trying to do. And we want to make sure that no one dies under police custody. No one dies.
So we've largely seen protests around the country remain peaceful. However, there was a horrific incident of police violence yesterday against a 75 elderly man who confronted, I believe, a police officer in Buffalo, New York. And a police officer actually shoved him to the ground where he began bleeding. And the video, we've received some of it's very disturbing, just as a warning. But let's take a listen, or watch, and just see how it all unfolded.
Entire world is crying. They are crying. They are cheering. He is wicked. He's not alive. He's clean out of here. Get him better. What the fuck you walking up on me? I'm moving
Back up. Get off the steps. Let's go. Get back. Get back.
Better get an ambulance for him.
We have EMT on scene.
And extra proof to fire rubber bullets on peaceful
I mean,
protesters.
speaks for itself, really. You can see also that we have statements now from the governor of New York and the mayor. Actually, so two of the officers that you saw that were involved in that incident have now been suspended. The mayor says he directed an immediate investigation into the matter that they've suspended without pays, and seems nearly certain about what the outcome of that is going to be. But I wanted to make sure that we highlighted this here. I know it's high tensions and all of that, but we have to acknowledge, somebody like me, pro law enforcement, whenever things like this are happening, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible, and we need to see accountability in these particular cases. And we'll bring you updates in terms of if there's an outrageous development in this case. We need to make sure that these two officers are fired, and that if there are charges that are necessary, that they be filed, disciplinary action. And this 75-year-old man, he did nothing wrong. He's in stable condition in the hospital, but he's 75 years old, and he had to bleed out of his ears for no particular reason. And there's no reason that needed to happen.
They said his condition is critical but stable. I mean, that video, it gets to, I mean, the whole thing is so disturbing, but the number of them that just keep walking, that there's not an immediate reaction to tend to him as he's bleeding out of his ear for, an elderly man. It's absolutely horrific. And, what are these protests about at their core? They're about police violence. And one of the things that, I think it's a lot of times state-sponsored violence is sort of normalized, or it's treated as not as important as the violence that we have seen that's also completely unjustifiable from some protesters. But it needs to be prosecuted and treated as just as outrageous, if not more, because these are trusted, these are supposed to be trusted law enforcement. They're supposed to be there to protect and serve, not to abuse and degrade and assault. These are people who are trying to assemble to exercise their First Amendment rights, and we point out violence and find it unconscionable wherever it's found. But to me, what is so disturbing is the number of incidences I've seen where, it's not just one bad apple who pushes him down and everybody rushes to his defense, just like with the George Floyd killing that you had, the Derek Chauvin with his knee on the man's neck, and you got three guys just basically standing there letting it happen. Or in Lafayette Park, that you had all these military police officers, park police, Secret Service agents who are gassing and firing rubber bullets at and flashbang grenades at peaceful protesters, and pushing journalists out of the way with riot shields. That sort of us versus them mob mentality is what I found incredibly disturbing that we've seen play out in place after place across the country. And I think it speaks to a deeper sort of systemic issue of how we do think about policing and how we've sort of pitted the police against the protesters and created this us versus them dynamic, and this group of people who are to be protected and a group that are to be policed. And in small incidents like this,
you see exactly what that mentality ultimately leads to. So as you said, we'll continue to follow the story and find out what happens with these officers, but just a horrific scene.
Yeah, I mean, it's horrible. And I think that this is something where, like I said, I know tensions are high, but from my perspective, look, law and order doesn't just apply to people who are looting stores, right? And it's as you said, which is that whenever the public entrusts public safety to people like this and enshrines them with big powers, and then they abuse that power, it's just as incumbent in keeping a law and order society in order to hold people like Officer Chauvin account, in order to make sure that Ahmaud Arbery's killers are taken into custody and to make sure they're charged at the highest degree possible, and that the federal government investigate whether the state and local authorities were corrupt in their handling of that case, and in making sure the officers involved in an incident like this are made, that they are brought to justice or have disciplinary action taken against them. And I want to make sure that everybody understands, not just from my perspective, but I think from anybody who really believes in justice, that the entire point of it is that it has to be applicable to everyone, and that includes, in this case, the state and state-sponsored violence. That like we said, we enshrine these people with enormous responsibilities, and with comes that is transparency. And if you're not anti-law enforcement for bringing it up, and you're not, and that's something that many people are going to have to deal with in this just really crazy environment. And it's very difficult, and understand, to stay calm and rational when looking at, incidents like this or from the other side. But that's the only way that we can live together.
Equality under the law. As Nina Turner would say, that's it and that's all. All right, we'll have more Rising for you after this.
Earlier this week, the stock market hit a 3-month high on the prospect of economic recovery, and at the same time, Bloomberg reported this week that only 1/3 of unemployment claims have been processed so far. So how did Wall Street rebound so fast?
Executive editor of the American Prospect, David Dayen, has a piece that explains exactly this, and he joins us now. Great to see you, David.
Good to see you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is one of the things that, it's kind of a hallmark of the dysfunction of our times. You have mass unemployment. You have 74%, I think, of the American public saying we're headed in the wrong direction. Millions being kicked off of health insurance, unable to make rent, chaos in the streets, and yet stock market's doing great. What's going on?
Well, it's really two words, and the two words are Federal Reserve. So if you actually dig in to the stock numbers and all the capital markets, really, not just stocks, you see that there was a deterioration in February and particularly in March, and everything ends on March 23rd, and there's this complete bounce back. Now, what happened on March 23rd? What was on that day that the Federal Reserve made an announcement that it would essentially do whatever it takes to prevent the investors from taking losses from the coronavirus crisis. That included the purchase of corporate debt, which it had never done in its entire history. And just the signal of that, just the announcement that everybody would be protected, followed by the CARES Act, which gave the sort of muscle behind that announcement by giving $500 billion to Treasury that it could use as part of this money cannon of $4.5 trillion that the Fed had at its disposal. That all was enough. And everything really proceeded from there. Stocks went way back up. Corporate bond ETFs that track corporate bond markets went way back up. Every major corporation floated debt, and everything sort of went back to normal for the markets.
And David, could you compare that? What's the disparity between the markets and then the real-time economic conditions for actual working Americans?
Well, it's interesting that we're talking today because we just had this good jobs report of 2.5 million increase in jobs in May. However, that was coming off this incredible cratering in April loss of over 20 million jobs. So, everybody's crowing here that we got back about 10% of what was lost. We're still seeing reports like a report from the Census Bureau that over almost half of all Americans lost income in the last couple months of this crisis. That shows up in the job statistics, but it's also just cuts to income from people who are working, whether they're getting furloughs or pay cuts or things like that. So there's incredible economic pain out there. It's masked a little bit by increased unemployment and these one-time stimulus checks, but that's all temporary. Yet the benefit to stocks and to investors is really permanent. And that's really the difference here. Congress could have given as much support to ordinary working people as they did to the investor class. But instead, we have this bifurcation. Everything that individuals got was time-limited and temporary, and everything that investors got was endless and enduring.
Yeah.
David, did you see, we covered on the show this sort of big, ugly fight that broke out between two CNBC anchors. And basically, one of them was arguing, look, stock market's fine. It's going fine. It's going to continue to go fine. And the other one is arguing essentially like, it can't be that disconnected from the reality of people's conditions. Like at some point, there is going to be some reflection in the markets of what a disaster economically we are facing for your average American citizen. How do you view that debate? Can it really be that wholly disconnected from the experience of the average American, where there's just like no relationship whatsoever between the two?
You're the press. Be the press.
Well, I mean, the first answer is that at some point when you have a situation like that, you're going to see social unrest. And what are we seeing right now? Not that the two are completely connected, but there is a case to be made that the pandemic and the economic collapse is in the mix here. So that's number one. Number two, there are ways that this real economy struggle is going to be channeled into financial markets, the biggest being commercial real estate. I see an absolute collapse there in commercial real estate, and that's something that's traded as securities, commercial mortgage-backed securities. That will find its way into financial markets and cause some trouble. The real question is, can the Fed hold it? Because the Fed hasn't spent really any money here. They've done this all through the power of suggestion. And you can kind of get away with that for a while, but at some point the Fed is going to have to step up and show its hand. And if it's only solving for liquidity when the problem is insolvency, that is going to catch up with the markets at some point. So that will sort of remain to be seen over the summer. And if we don't get further relief from Congress, which this good jobs report is going to make more difficult, you're going to see problems in state and local spending. You're going to see more business bankruptcies, commercial real estate slipping. And those are all real economy things that could find their way into the capital market.
So that's one thing I'm really concerned about, David. And as you rightfully said on the unemployment rate, which is that, we got back 10%, but we're still that's just in terms of what we got back from a slightly reopening. We don't know how many are still lost to the actual economic depression that we're in. Do you have any estimate for us on what that depression number looks like? I've seen everything in the 10 to 15% employment range. What do you think?
Since this all started.
Right. I mean, right now we're at 13.3 according to these latest numbers. And there's this long note at the bottom of the jobs report that says that because of some mismeasurement, if people who are actually not working right now were measured correctly, that number would be at 16%. And that's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They further went on to say it would have been at 19% in April if that was all in place. What we're seeing right now is that some of these temporary layoffs have come back online as businesses have reopened over the last 4 weeks. And that's certainly good to see. The fact that only gets you about 10% at this point means that we have a long way to go. And the temporary layoffs that were transferred into permanent layoffs in the jobs report actually went up in May. So there is room to fall. And if state and local governments, which have lost 1.5 million jobs just in the last 2 months, don't get relief, you're going to see that number fall, and that could create a cascading effect. That's what we haven't seen yet, where bad jobs numbers lead to less revenue and less discretionary spending, leading to more layoffs. We haven't seen that yet. And if we do see that, then the economy can sort of fold in on itself. And that's my fear if there's no relief. I mean, the state of New Jersey has said if they don't get any help from the federal government, they're going to have to cut half the public workforce, 200,000 jobs. So, broaden that out to the rest of the country.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate your analysis.
All right. Thank you.
All right. We'll have more Rising for you after this.
Marchers are now turning north on 13th Street.
Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. But, Crystal, why do we look so different? What's happening?
Well, I'm going to be super real with you guys. We're a little bit exhausted, so we still have a lot of great content for you today, but we did scale it back.
Tired.
Just a touch. We'll be back at it, I promise, on Monday. But we've got some great guests. We've got some great topics, important topics that we need to tackle today. Glenn Greenwald is going to be on. He's talking about the intersection of coronavirus and the uprisings across the country. We've got David Dayen on with an update on housing and what's going on financially in the country. We also have John Nichols on. He had an interview with Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison. So a lot of news to talk about with him there. And Sagar, there's a bunch of new developments in both the Ahmaud Arbery case and the George Floyd case, as well as a new March on Washington announced yesterday as well.
Yeah, that's right. So let's begin with the new March on Washington announced by Reverend Al Sharpton at that memorial service for George Floyd, announced with his family, scheduled to take place now in August. Let's take a listen to what the Reverend said yesterday.
That's where your father stood in the shadows of the Lincoln Memorial and said, I have a dream. Well, we're going back this August 28th to restore and recommit that dream, to stand up, because just like at one era we had to fight slavery, another era we had to fight Jim Crow, another era we dealt with voting rights, this is the era to deal with policing and criminal justice. We need to go back to Washington and stand up, black, white, Latino, Arab, in the shadows of Lincoln, and tell them this is the time to stop this.
So a major development there, obviously calling for both the August March, and I think they're pairing it explicitly with a piece of legislation on the Police Brutality Act. I don't yet have the details exactly on what we propose there, but it is a bigger step in terms of what these protests are really calling for. And you can kind of pair it right up against the news that we got yesterday. So we brought everybody the news yesterday around how the 4 officers involved in the murder of George Floyd were charged. Well, now we know that 2 of the officers actually, well, first we can start with the personnel files were actually released on Officer Derek Chauvin, which is something that has caused a little bit of consternation. Let's put the personnel files up there on the screen, and you can see actually that Officer Chauvin had several run-ins and complaints against him over the years. Of course, that's something that we already knew, but this is just even more of an insight into some of his conduct and the way that he was able to get away with it for so long.
Yes, 17, I believe, internal investigations based on civilian complaints. He'd been involved in shootings before. And part of what came out yesterday is we're starting to see the approach of the defense, at least of a few of the other officers, not Derek Chauvin, but the other 3 who basically stood by and watched everything, who've also been charged at this point. 2 of them were brand new on the force, and Derek Chauvin was essentially training them So, you know, two of the colleagues, you know, one of them this was his third shift. The other one, I believe this was his fourth day on the job, with the idea being, and the defense that's being offered is basically, you know, they were just doing what they were told. They were following the direction of their lead officer. And on the one hand, like, I can understand that. On the other hand, you had bystanders standing by who weren't trained by anyone, who weren't police officers, who were just civilians, who were calling out, what are you doing? He's, you know, he's not resisting. Does he have a pulse? So any human being, whether you're trained, not trained, early to the police force, not early to the police force, could see that this was a horrible and problematic situation. We could all see that watching it unfold on the video.
Yeah, I mean, we brought everybody the tearful, you know, that tearful, not testimony, but the reflection of that innocent, the bystander, who I think he filmed some of the incident, who was, I think he was well versed in martial arts, talking about the jiu-jitsu move of putting, you know, his hand, the knee on his neck, and he was pleading with the officer to take it away. I mean, it was 8 minutes and 49 seconds, and that was plenty of time, I think, for a lot of people to be involved here. But it's a caution, because this is the type of thing which, when presented to a jury, we should remember that, you know, police often do not get away necessarily, but often if the charge is, you know, not, if the charge can, if reasonable doubt can be created based on the charge in the jury's mind, and in this particular case they can say, look, we didn't really know what we were doing, like, we were being trained by Officer Chauvin, and honestly, I mean, at that point they can even blame the police force for, you know, why are you putting a person who's had 17 different internal investigations and complaints against his behavior in charge of training these junior officers and then taking them out into this type of incident. You can foresee how this might cause trouble for the prosecution in a court of law.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Police officers get off all the time at very high rates. So charges are one thing and convictions are a very different thing. And as we discussed before, we should all remember that in the 92 LA riots, after it was after the officers were let off, it was after the jury failed to convict the officers involved in the beating of Rodney King, that things really exploded. So really important to keep our eye on those developments, both in terms of just justice for George Floyd and for his family, and also for a whole community that is really hurting there, and a whole nation that is watching closely, but also for where things go from here, because we've now had, you know, several nights of largely peaceful protests. We're going to bring you some more details on that moving forward. We have a call from Reverend Al for a large march on Washington. I was actually MC of the last March on Washington that Reverend Al brought into that city, and I bet we're gonna see just unbelievable numbers of citizens coming out, because honestly, I've never seen a movement like this ever before. I live out, as you know, Sagar, like out kind of in the middle of nowhere in Virginia. It's a very conservative town. It's a southern town. It's a town that voted for President Trump by some, 30 points or so. And yesterday, I've never seen a protest. This is my hometown. This is where I grew up, born and raised. I have never seen in my lifetime a protest in King George County, Virginia. And yesterday, as I was just driving around with my kids, there were people on the street corners holding up signs that said silence is violence. I mean, that's how far this has spread. There have been protests in Harlan County, Kentucky, and Mayfield, Kentucky, that my friends have been sending photos of there. This is a movement, the likes of which I really have never seen. So I think that March on Washington is going to truly be a historic event. At the same time, we're also getting additional horrifying details of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, something else that was part of sparking this movement that we're seeing across the country. So you'll recall, part of why we knew what happened there was that one of the individuals involved actually filmed the whole thing. So initially, there were no charges, there were no arrests, and then this video comes out of the actual shooting and murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and that's when there were charges, that's when something actually happened. Well, the man who did the filming is now saying that he heard Travis McMichael is the one who allegedly fired those shots that killed Ahmaud Arbery, using a racial slur as he stood over the dead body of Ahmaud Arbery. There's also been additional reporting that, if you go into his social media, the N-word is thrown around a number of times. obviously puts some additional context on this, but even more significantly, this could be evidence that this isn't just a murder. This is actually a hate crime and necessitates a federal civil rights investigation, which the family, by the way, says is already underway.
Right. I think that's the most significant piece of evidence, and this is something I think would be very welcome. I certainly want to see it, which is that the federal hate crime charges and were specifically created in order to investigate incidents like this. And I think there also needs to be a very major probe into that Georgia county, which allowed, basically both the McMichaels to walk free for almost a period of 2 entire months. And we know from some of the reporting on the ground there that McMichaels, a former police officer, had kind of ingratiated himself with the prosecutor's office. He'd actually done some private investigatory work from there, and that prosecutor who initially had said that it's plausible self-defense was the one who explicitly rejected any sort of charge against the McMichaels. So the longer and the more that we learn about this is exactly why the Federal Civil Rights Division was created, and we were allowed to investigate hate crimes in this way. And we want to see as much as we possibly can. And in terms of the political moment, I think you're absolutely right, which is, really haven't seen anything like this. From my own hometown, I think the only thing that you ever see in terms of protests are like March for Life. And yet, I'm hearing reports of the same thing. Actually, Mr. Floyd's son lives in the hometown that I grew up in. So it's also been a particular flashpoint there. But we are also seeing beginnings of a movement of not necessarily backlash, but the police officers and the unions are also mobilizing their own considerable political resources. So the police unions had come out and said that they do not want, they're trying to fight back against having disciplinary records or records released into the public eye, but also significant backlash against law enforcement groups against Joe Biden's campaign for a seeming alliance with some of the protest movement. It reminds me a lot of the 2016 election, where you saw, police officers overwhelmingly voted for President Trump, and it was something that he made a real point of his campaign, like standing with law enforcement against Hillary Clinton and much of that. And it was one of the more political elections that we saw in terms of law enforcement. And now, given the political ground that we have, I actually expect that to ratchet up, if not down, which I don't think is a good thing. The more political that these things get, it's actually terrible for our politics, and it just becomes more partisan in terms of if law enforcement is seen explicitly siding with one or the other party, that is not good.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I also think it's indicative of a broader shift and broader realignment in the country as a whole. I mean, Joe Biden, I would say still is, but has long been, quote unquote, law and order, architect of mass incarceration, 94 crime bill that he still supports, by the way. But clearly, is moving based on the moment and is trying to reach for some reforms that he can get on board with. I still personally think he's very conservative on these issues, but certainly not in the same place as Trump is now. But it's also the police unions themselves have moved right. I mean, in that some of the previous legislation, police unions worked with Democrats, including Joe Biden, on things like gun control. Now that has become totally, off the table. So there's been a real divergence there, and the police unions have moved really far to the right. I would say not just the Democratic Party, but obviously, President Trump passed the First Step Act. So there's been a change nationally in terms of criminal justice and how those issues are viewed. There's been a backlash on stop and frisk and other aggressive policing tactics. So the police unions have really moved to the right in a way that puts them out of step, not only with Joe Biden, but I would say with much of the country at this point.
Yeah, I mean, they are very, you can see it actually probably nowhere better than New York City, where they're basically in open war with Mayor de Blasio on a day-to-day basis, turning his back on them and many of these other things. And like I said, I think if I'm a supporter of law enforcement, but if they make themselves this explicitly political, it can have dangerous ramifications by ramping that up. But I also sympathize if they do feel like truly under attack. But as we just covered now, I mean, we cannot whitewash incidents of police violence, and we're going to cover some of that later here, and there always has to be accountability. So it's a delicate balance that we're all going to have.
You can't hide the disciplinary records. I mean, that should be something
Right.
people know. I mean, it's part of how we ended up with this horrific situation in Minneapolis, is you had an officer who, you know, Amy Klobuchar basically abdicated her responsibility on the local officials, didn't do what they needed to do, but also that you have someone with this level of complaints who not only is still on the force and not disciplined, but is actually training new officers. I mean, that, you know, is deeply, deeply troubling. But I also want to say, and this was a point that Max Alvarez said yesterday, and you know, we can kind of close up this discussion on this note. The policing, the specifics around police reform are important. And I'm glad people are focused on that. I think that needs to be sort of step one here. But you can't remove the system of policing from the overall system. You can't remove the incident of Mr. Floyd without also talking about why so many people are in the position where they would be desperate enough to be passing a counterfeit $20 bill to start with. Because when you have a class that is a mass underclass, which is disproportionately black and brown, that is treated as less than human, you're going to end up with cruelty and injustice, whether it's in policing, whether it's in day-to-day life, whether it's in racism and the way that's expressed on a daily basis as well. So I hope the conversation, while we, you know, take the first steps on police reform, and I do think that's critical, I hope we have a more systemic look at this as well, and that March on Washington focuses on some of those issues too. That was what Dr. Martin Luther King, you know, when he was assassinated, that's what he was really fighting for. Is we have to bring people of all races together. We have to secure their economic rights if we're really ever going to be whole as a nation, and have people feel agency and have dignity and worth within this society. So I hope that we continue to push that conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually something that's really frustrated me around this entire discussion, is that I feel like so much of that has been missing, right? I mean, 50%, I think this is the most salient thing, 50% of black Americans in America right now are unemployed, 50%. And we're not having a real discussion, no much of the political will, and much of what we've seen from the, you know, the cultural elites who purport to support this protest. Who is calling for payroll replacement? Who is calling for making sure that we keep businesses and all these other places whole? And I think that the conversation, when it starts to move in that direction, it'll be a lot. I think it will really, you know, solve some of the core problems that we see at the center of unrest that we see in America right now.
All right, we're going to have more Rising for you after this.
They gave no warning. So, yeah. That's the question of speech that finest coming from government, which is what your First Amendment is about. It is about protecting you.
We all dream of finding an ancient or valuable treasure, cashing it in by selling it and living the good.
From Main Street.
I saw somebody standing in front of a church the other day had been boarded up as a result of violence, held the Bible in his hand. I've been preaching since I was a little boy. I never seen anyone hold a Bible like that, but I'll leave that alone. But since he held the Bible, if he's watching us today, I would like him to open that Bible. And I'd like him to read Ecclesiastes 3. To every season, there's a time and a purpose. And I think that it is our job to let the world know, when we see what is going on in the streets of this country and in Europe, around the world, that you need to know what time it is. First of all,
yes,
we
this is
cannot
live.
use
Currently
Bibles
it's
as a prop.
9:56 p.m.
And for
in,
those that
Washington,
have
D.C.
agendas that are not about justice, this family will not let you use George as a prop.
He's bleeding out of his ear. Get a medic. What the fuck you walking up on me? I'm moving down. Get the fuck away. Stop. Y'all don't want this shit.
Oh, shit.
For our main story tonight, I'd actually like to talk about how the president spent the first half of his week, because for some reason, in the midst of 40 million Americans unemployed, 100,000 Americans dead, and racial tensions boiling over, he chose to spend his days focusing on this.
President Trump overnight taking to Twitter to take on Twitter, along with other social media giants, for what he calls political bias. It comes after Twitter for the first time added a fact-check footnote on 2 of his tweets that called mail-in ballots substantially fraudulent.
Yeah, Twitter fact-checked the president's tweets. They're also apparently fact-checking other tweets as well, but clearly not all of them, because we just tweeted, Luke is the best Hemsworth, and so far that has not been flagged as a damaging lie. And come on, Twitter, either your system works or it doesn't. It is a known fact that the order goes Chris Hemsworth, Liam Hemsworth, no Hemsworths, then Luke. But it is worth taking a look at the underlying statement that caused Twitter to act. Trump's claim that voting by mail in this year's elections will be substantially fraudulent, because that is a favourite subject of his. He's tweeted about it a ridiculous number of times in the last 2 months, and he brings it up constantly.
For this country, because they're cheaters. They go and collect them. They're fraudulent in many cases. The mail ballots are corrupt, in my opinion. And they collect them, and they get people to go in and sign them, and then they're forgeries in many cases. It's a horrible thing.
Now, what he just said there was complete bullshit and actively harmful to the democratic process, but in a weird way. It's almost comforting to hear him busting out his classic 2016 hits about voter fraud and rigged elections. It brings you back to a simpler time, doesn't it, when we could go to restaurants freely, we had no idea what Zoom was, and we were sure that an obviously unqualified presidential candidate was going to lose in a historic landslide. Oh, 2016. You truly were the good old, only less horrifying in context days. And the thing is, voting by mail is a popular idea. 70% of us are in favour of allowing any voter to vote by mail if they want to. And if this pandemic continues into the fall, as it almost certainly will, many voters will want to do exactly that. Because think about it, holding an in-person election during a pandemic is an absolute nightmare. Elections usually involve hundreds of people cycling in and out of a single enclosed location, plus polling places are often located in communal buildings like schools and nursing homes, and many of those are out of the question right now. Even keeping poll workers safe can be difficult because, according to one estimate, while the typical voter may encounter only about 20 other people when they go to the polls, the typical poll worker will encounter about 700, and many are understandably concerned about that.
I never thought I'd say this in my time, but this really scares me, this kind of thing. I never thought I'd see it.
For McGee and a majority of poll workers, they're retired in their 60s or 70s, and health experts say this age group is among some of the most vulnerable to the virus.
Even if we have a line of 10 people, how are we going to keep everybody, safe from the germs? We have a touch screen. we'll have to wipe that down every time. Are we supposed to have people bring their own pencil?
No, of course not. And not just because they shouldn't have to, but also, who the hell owns a fully functioning pencil? I mean, sure, you might have one with a usable eraser, but an unusable tip. Or maybe you have one with a sharpened tip, but the eraser's gone. Or maybe you've got one with a functioning tip, but the eraser's all hard and leaves like a brown streak on the paper. And yeah, you could sharpen any of these pencils, but with what? A pencil sharp? Oh, unless you do, in which case, just answer me this. Where is it? Exactly. If you think you're in any way prepared to bring a working pencil to a polling station, then you, my friend, are living in a fucking fantasy world. Now, that woman actually decided not to work her state's primary out of fear for her safety, and many voters share her concerns. But not all state officials are addressing those concerns especially well. Just listen to Missouri's Governor Mike Parson offer advice ahead of next week's local elections there.
You know, I hope people feel safe, but to go out and vote. But if they don't, you know, the number one thing is their safety should be number one. So if they don't, then don't go out and vote. You know, I don't know that I've ever heard myself say that, but you know, if you didn't feel safe, then I wouldn't do that.
Well, hold on there. Voting is a right. It has to be easy to understand and accessible to everyone, unlike, say, HBO Max. What the fuck is that, by the way? Does anyone actually know? How do I get it? I'm on it and I don't know. And why is it so purple? It's like I'm watching television from inside Grimace's arsehole, and not in a good way. Now, there are a lot of ways to mitigate the dangers here, but perhaps the biggest is expanding the option to vote by mail. You know, the thing that Trump lies about so often, Twitter finally decided to step in. So tonight, let's take a look at why the option of voting by mail is so necessary, why concerns about it are often overblown, and why talking about it right now is actually really important. And let's start with the fact that we actually have a pretty good lesson for just how badly an election during a pandemic can be bungled, thanks to Wisconsin. They held their primary just last month, and it was absolute chaos, partly because their Democratic governor had tried to delay it, only to be thwarted by the Republican-controlled state legislature and Supreme Court. And the Republican Assembly Speaker Robin Vos tried to reassure people that everything was safe while volunteering at a polling place, but something about how he delivered that message was a little unconvincing.
You think voting in person is putting people at risk today?
I don't. I mean, I look at this and say to myself that we have every single opportunity to be safe.
Do you, Robin? Do you? Because you're sending two very different messages there. Your mouth is saying, don't worry, everything's safe and cool, but it's been slightly undercut by the fact your dress code is Chernobyl casual. And unsurprisingly, many didn't buy his assurances. Due to safety concerns, there was a massive reduction of polling sites in some big cities, with Milwaukee's 180 polling sites being reduced down to just 5. Resulting in massive lines. And adding to the chaos was the fact a record number of mail ballots were requested, hundreds of which never resulted in sights like this immunocompromised woman casting her ballot while wearing a garbage bag. And no one should have to wear a garbage bag because they're trying to vote. You should only have to wear one because you're trying to shed excess water weight so you look extra jacked. Oh yeah, I haven't stopped my pump routine just because of the lockdown. I still catch the Diesel Express every day. The sun don't shine before this swollen eclipse runs its course. You might as well put me in a tortilla with some salsa and lime because my beef is shredded. Look, having been put into this position, you can kind of understand why the voters in Wisconsin were so pissed.
This is so wrong. This is just so wrong. This election should have been called off. You know, they're telling us to stay in the house and, you know, stand 6 feet from each other, but then one of the most important times, they're forcing us to come out here in a group. Stop playing politics.
That must have been frustrating because you can't pretend coronavirus has stopped for a day in order to hold an election. It doesn't give a fuck about democracy. It's just one of the many ways that COVID-19 is also, of course, weirdly shaped and disproportionately harmful to minorities. And remember, that was just a primary. November's general election will have a much higher turnout. So, how do we prevent 50 times over? Well, one obvious answer is to make it easier to vote by mail. But some argue that that's a dangerously radical proposition.
Everyone's afraid, everyone's rethinking how we do things. We should be open-minded. Why haven't we had mail-in ballots for the last 230 years? Maybe the reason is mail-in ballots are an invitation to widespread fraud and manipulation. And if you want to rattle people's faith in the system that we've had for centuries, maybe you would do that. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. You don't know? Oh, well, first off, Tucker, thanks so much for admitting that. One of the biggest problems with modern discourse is that people think admitting a lack of knowledge is a sign of weakness, when it's not, is it? It's how we learn and grow as individuals. So it's really heartening to see someone in your position admit that they don't have all the facts. Facts like, for instance, that we've had voting by mail since the Civil War, and that 1 in 4 Americans actually cast a mail ballot in the last 2 federal elections. So your premise that voting by mail is a new idea that would shatter democracy is in fact completely wrong and deeply stupid. That's not a reflection on you, though, is it?
So definitely, get out there, make sure you know what you're doing. Black lives matter. 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 I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. No peace. No peace.
No, he was dressed in a Batman costume. I'm just curious, I see a lot of people asking questions like, is this live? Is there confusion about if this is live or not? Like, is there a way to watch this without telling that it's live? I can assure everyone that's watching this, it's live. It's a perfectly peaceful protest. I've not seen any looting, I've not seen any violence. Completely peaceful. Yeah, I also get questions about how many people are here. Guys, I'm really bad at estimating that number. Yeah, a few hundred easily. A few hundred people are definitely here, but that's about as specific as I'm going to get because I'm not one of those guys that can count fast. There is media presence. I see at least 3, maybe 4 or 5 news cameras. So, yeah. Still getting a lot of attention. I saw somebody request that I get an elevated location. It's kind of challenging. What I can do is just hold the camera higher. Tomorrow, I believe everything starts at 2 p.m. I plan on being out here for as long as I can, for as long as I have battery life. And I hope that there's many other people doing what I'm doing coming out as well.
see vote count. Cause your body ready, gotta register. Then vote, then vote, gotta register.
saw somebody asking if I've seen the elderly people. Yes, I have seen elderly people at this march and in the protest. I am noticing that people are slowly making their way home. I see several people going down 16th Street. I think a lot of people are anticipating a long day tomorrow, so probably going home to get some rest, start fresh tomorrow. I'll be out here at 2 p.m. as well. I know I normally start at like 5 or 6, but I think that this is going to be a pretty big event, so it's important that I'm out there. Something else that I've noted, I have not seen any park police in Lafayette, at least not in riot gear or anything like that. I've seen a lot of vehicles. There's vehicles parked in Lafayette, and there's tents in Lafayette. So I don't know if there's just people that are stationed in there now and ready to deploy quickly if they need to.